Say the word Hemi, and one engine comes to mind. The big orange 426, the elephant, the one bolted into Roadrunners and Superbirds. But that engine was not the first Hemi. It was not even close. Nearly 15 years earlier, Chrysler built a Hemi that beat Cadillac, powered the most powerful car in America, and then went on to rule the drag strip for the better part of a decade. It wore a name straight off a fighter plane, Firepower, and almost nobody talks about it anymore. In 1955, Chrysler put a car on the road called the C300. It made 300 horsepower, and at the time, nothing else built in America came close. You have to go all the way back to the hand-built Duesenbergs of the 1930s to find the last American car that powerful. People called it the banker's hot rod because it looked like the kind of car a bank president would drive to church, right up until the light turned green. And the engine doing all of that had started its life in a warplane. That aircraft past would end up being the whole story. The very thing that made this engine brilliant is the same thing that would get it axed before hauling it back from the scrap heap years later. But in the early 1950s, none of that had happened yet. Chrysler was just a company with a reputation for sensible, sturdy, slightly boring cars. Scrambling to catch Cadillac and Oldsmobile in a horsepower race, everybody had suddenly decided to care about. During the war, Chrysler's engineers had been handed a strange assignment: build an aircraft engine for a fighter plane. What they came back with was a monster, an inverted V16 displacing more than 2,200 cubic inches, designed to make around 2,500 horsepower. To get it breathing that hard, they used a hemispherical combustion chamber, a dome-shaped space at the top of each cylinder with the spark plug in the middle and big valves on either side. They bolted one of these things into a P-47 Thunderbolt to test it, and the story goes it shoved that fighter past 500 miles an hour, though that number has been argued over ever since. The war ended before any of it went anywhere, but the engineers had learned something they were not about to forget. That dome shape breathes. Air and fuel pour in, burn fast and clean, and leave through valves far too big to ever fit inside an ordinary flat cylinder head. It made more power, it made it on cheaper fuel, and Chrysler's head of engineering had the test data to prove it. There was a catch, and it was a big one, but we will come back to that. The man running Chrysler loved the idea and forced it into the passenger cars, over the objections of people who thought it was too fancy and too expensive to ever build. Inside the company, they called it the double rocker engine, after the tangle of valve gear it needed. To the public, they gave it a much better name: Firepower. The man who forced it through was Chrysler's own president, and he did it because he trusted his engineers over his accountants. Those engineers built the thing to last too. One of them set a durability target of 100,000 miles at a time when plenty of engines were considered worn out at half of that. And just to show how far the design could stretch, Chrysler used a version of this same Hemi to build an air raid siren for the Cold War, a machine so loud it measured around 138 decibels from 100 feet away. Still, one of the loudest sirens ever made. The same basic engine that was about to terrify Cadillac could also be heard from the next county over. The first one arrived in 1951 at 331 cubic inches, making 180 horsepower. That number matters because Cadillac had its own 331 in the same era, and it made 160. So Chrysler took the exact same size engine as the king of American luxury and beat it by 20 horsepower while burning lower-grade fuel. That same year, a Chrysler paced the Indianapolis 500, and the sturdy, boring car company suddenly had the quickest thing in its class. It backed the bragging up on the road, too. A Hemi-powered Chrysler could run from 0 to 60 in around 12 seconds, quicker than the Cadillac, and right there with the Oldsmobile, the two cars everyone in America measured themselves against. It even went road racing in Europe. A Chrysler running this engine took a class win at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1953, which is not a sentence you expect to hear about a 1950s Chrysler. Here is the part almost nobody knows. There was not one early Hemi. There were several, and they did not fit each other. Chrysler had the Firepower. Dodge built its own smaller Hemi and called it the Red Ram. DeSoto built a third one, sized in the middle, and called it the Fire Dome. 3 separate engines, 3 different sets of blocks and heads, none of them interchangeable, all under the same corporate roof at the same time. Plymouth, the cheap brand, got none of it. If that sounds like an absurdly expensive way to run an engine program, hold that thought because it is going to matter a great deal in a few minutes. Then Chrysler did the thing that turned a good engine into a legend. They took the Hemi, added 2 4-barrel carburetors and a hot camshaft, and dropped it into a low, sleek 2-door for 1955. That was the C300, the 300 horsepower car we opened with. These were not cheap either. The 300 was a low-volume, high-dollar machine, the sort of car you special ordered, and Chrysler built only around 1,700 of that first one. Exclusive, fast, and just civilized enough that nobody saw the racing pedigree coming until it had already gone by them. And it was not just fast on paper. Chrysler sent these cars stock car racing, and that is where they ran into a man named Carl Kiekhaefer. Kiekhaefer built outboard boat motors, and he was completely obsessive. He bought a fleet of white Chrysler 300s, painted them all to match, hauled them to the track in matching transporters, and ran his team like a military unit. Stock car racing had never seen anything like it. In 1955, his driver Tim Flock won 18 races and the championship. 18 wins in a single season, a record that would stand until a young Richard Petty finally broke it more than a decade later. Kiekhaefer's white Chryslers won so often and so completely across 2 straight seasons that fans in the grandstands started booing them just for showing up. That was only round 1. Kiekhaefer got so sick of the booing that he quit the sport entirely after just 2 years. As the reigning champion, he had made his point. Before he left, his team had strung together a run of 16 straight wins across those 2 seasons, the kind of streak that simply does not happen in stock car racing. The firepower was the car everyone else was chasing, and the Hemi party was not only a Chrysler affair. DeSoto, one of those forgotten sister brands, built its own hot version called the Adventurer that made 345 horsepower out of 345 cubic inches, hitting that 1 horsepower per cube mark as standard equipment. The whole corporation was suddenly swimming in Hemi power, which felt wonderful, right up until somebody in the accounting office finally added up what all of it cost. The engine kept growing right alongside the trophies. For 1956, the Racing 300, now called the 300B, offered a version that made 355 horsepower out of 354 cubic inches. 1 horsepower for every single cubic inch. American engineers had been chasing that exact number for years, and Chrysler got there a full year before Chevrolet managed it with the fuel-injected small block everybody still talks about. And even so, when people sit around listing the great American engines, this one barely comes up. You would think somebody would have said something. Nobody did. But the firepower was not done climbing. It had one last, biggest version left in it, and it is the one the whole legend really rests on. In 1957, it grew to 392 cubic inches. In the 300C, it made 375 horsepower standard, and if you tick the box for the hottest version, 390, the 300C was also the first of these cars you could get as a convertible, which meant you could now drop the top and still leave almost anything else on the road behind. It made more than 400 pounds of torque, the kind of low-down shove that moved the car the instant your foot touched the pedal. The next year, in the 300D, Chrysler pushed it further still, up to 380 horsepower with a pair of 4 barrels. This was the firepower at the very top of its game, which, naturally, is exactly the moment it began to come apart. For 1958, Chrysler also offered something that sounded like science fiction. Electronic fuel injection, managed by what was basically the first onboard computer ever fitted to an American car, rated at 390 horsepower. It also barely ran. The system was so unreliable that most of the cars fitted with it were quietly brought back in and switched over to ordinary carburetors. That little failure was a warning sign, a hint that this engine had gotten about as complicated and as costly as an engine could possibly get. Chrysler was pouring more and more money into a design that was already the heaviest and the most expensive way to make horsepower anywhere in Detroit. Something had to give. If you are enjoying this one, take a second and subscribe. This channel goes looking for the engines and the cars that history drove right past, and there are more of them than you would believe. Now, back to the firepower, because Chrysler was about to throw this engine in the trash, and that one decision is exactly what turned it into a legend. Ending the Hemi was not an emotional decision. It was arithmetic. The same clever design that let the engine breathe so beautifully made it a nightmare to build. Those big hemispherical heads needed two separate rocker shafts per side instead of one, a maze of extra parts, and each finished head weighed around 120 pounds. A Cadillac head of the day weighed closer to 90, so every firepower was heavier, wider, and slower to machine than the engine in a rival's car, and it earned Chrysler a fortune in exactly nobody's showroom. Chrysler had already built the way out. It was called the Wedge, a simpler, lighter cylinder head that made nearly the same power for far less money. The company had even quietly built a cheaper cousin of the Hemi's own bottom end, called the Poly, sold under a Spitfire badge, that gave up a little power and saved a lot of cash. Here is the number that ended the whole argument. In its final year, the true Hemi version of the smaller engine made 350 horsepower, while the Poly version of the very same engine made 310. For most buyers, that 40 horsepower gap simply was not worth the extra weight and the extra money, and the Wedge that would replace all of it came in some 70 or 80 pounds lighter still. Somebody inside Chrysler had seen this coming for years and kept warning that the Hemi cost too much to justify. When the accountants finally lined all of it up, the verdict wrote itself. After 1958, the firepower was gone. The Wedge took over, and the Hemi name disappeared from Chrysler completely. It would not return until 1964 on a completely different engine, the one everybody now thinks of as the first. The original had lasted 8 model years and then simply vanished, remembered by almost no one. That should have been the end of it. Enter the drag racers. Out in California and clear across the country, a scrappy crowd of men building the fastest and most dangerous cars in America went hunting for an engine that could survive being supercharged and fed nitromethane, a fuel that sits closer to an explosive than to gasoline. Wedge engines cracked and blew apart under that kind of punishment. The old firepower Hemi did not. That same dome-shaped chamber that made it breathe so well also took punishing cylinder pressure better than anything else they could get their hands on. So the engine Detroit had thrown in the bin became the single most wanted engine in drag racing. There is a simple reason for that. When you force a supercharger and a load of nitro into a cylinder, the pressure inside turns savage, and a flat-headed Wedge engine tends to split right open under it. The Hemi's rounded chamber spread that load out and held together where the others let go. Garlits ran these engines in his early cars, the ones he called his swamp rats, feeding them fuel that was nearly 90% nitromethane, numbers that would melt an ordinary motor into a puddle. Names that are legends today built their whole careers on it, men like Don Garlits, Chris Karamessines, and Connie Kalita. They bolted superchargers on top of junkyard 392s, poured in the nitro, and went looking for records. The story goes that Karamessines was the first man ever to cross 200 miles an hour in a dragster on a strip in Illinois, though the timing gear that day got questioned and the run was never made official. What is official is that a few years later, Garlits himself became the first to break 200 with clocks that everybody trusted. Either way, the barrier fell behind a blown early Hemi. And no, that is not a coincidence. Racers never bothered with the firepower name. To them, it was simply the early Hemi, and it stayed the engine to beat in the fastest, most dangerous classes of drag racing well into the 1960s, long after Chrysler itself had walked away from it. An engine can be forgotten by the public and worshipped by the people who actually use it, both at the very same time, and it never really went away. Walk through the pits at a nostalgia drag race today, more than 60 years later, and you will still hear blown firepower Hemis lighting up the starting line. There is an entire industry that exists for no other reason than to keep these engines alive, machining brand new parts for a motor Chrysler stopped building before most of the drivers running them were even born. You will find them out at the Bonneville Salt Flats chasing top speed records, and at nostalgia events where crews fire up old dragsters just to stand there and let them roar, a ritual the fans lovingly call a cackle fest. 60 years on, grown men still gather around this engine just to hear it idle. That is not something that happens to an engine nobody cared about. When Chrysler brought back a modern engine and stamped 392 on the side of it a few years ago, they did that on purpose. A quiet nod to this exact engine, even though the new one is not really a Hemi in the old sense at all. There is even a small secret buried in all of it. The purists will tell you that neither the modern engine nor even the very first firepower was ever a perfect half-sphere on the inside. The real thing was always a bit of a compromise. But the idea behind it, that a better-shaped chamber makes better power, was sound enough to carry Chrysler for the better part of 70 years. So here is where it all lands. The Hemi everyone worships, the orange 426, gets the credit for a reputation this engine built first. The firepower beat Cadillac, made the most powerful car in America, won until the crowd booed, and then went out and set records after its own company had walked away from it. It did every bit of it first, wearing a name pulled off a fighter plane. The Hemi legend did not start with the engine you remember. It started with this one. And that beach where those white Chryslers made everyone else look parked? That is a whole story of its own, and it is the one I am telling next.